Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. There were several approaches to how Reconstruction should be carried out, how the country should be reassembled and move forward, and all of them were riddled with controversy and compromise, and all of them were ultimately incomplete, and all of them seem doomed to fail. Turn with us now to those thrilling days of yesteryear, when out of the past come the thundering hoofbeats of Wahlberg's A-Push. History class rides again! We have two objectives today. By the end of this class, you should be able to evaluate the approaches of Lincoln and Johnson and the radical Republicans to all carry out Reconstruction. And you should also be able to summarize the events of Johnson's impeachment and Grant's election. But let's begin in Roman numeral number 13. Lincoln's Reconstruction plan was one of those that, initially the 10% plan was a very forgiving plan. His Reconstruction plan, basically was, I think, politically untenable. You see, the Constitution didn't address the question of secession or procedure for any reconstruction. So it didn't say which branch of government was to handle the readmission of rebellious states. Lincoln offered that general amnesty to all but the high-ranking Confederate officials who were willing to pledge loyalty to the Union. And remember, when 10% of a state people had taken that oath of loyalty and the state had abolished slavery, the state could be restored to the Union. Most of the Confederate states rejected this idea. They rebuffed the offer, ensuring that they would have to go fight the Civil War until the bitter end. The Lincoln goes and tries to deal with this question of slavery with a group that's also part of his Reconstruction idea, known as the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau was initiated by Lincoln, and it was intended to last 1 year after the end of the Civil War. And this Freedmen's Bureau would direct the provisions of clothing and fuel and food for the immediate and temporary shelter and the supply of destitute and suffering refugees and freedmen and their wives and children. It was basically a refugee program and a humanitarian program. As soon as slavery ends and all the people that were displaced or fleeing from war going to need to be cared for a year, and this was the Freedmen's Bureau who was going to be placed into an administration of doing it. And the task was daunting. I mean, this would have been a huge undertaking, and it would have been a huge undertaking with fewer than 1,000 agents because of the Southern legislatures had passed these black codes that restricted movements, the conditions of labor, and just the other civil rights of African Americans, and all of these things. There's only 1,000 people doing it. Even though slavery was going to be abolished, after the 13th Amendment, a lot of the social conditions and economic conditions and legal conditions ended up almost duplicating slavery in the South. Anyway, the Bureau, that it had any achievements at all is pretty striking. But it did, notably in education and in healthcare. Nearly 3,000 schools reported to the Bureau as a way of increasing access to education. The congressional Republicans proposed their alternative to Lincoln's 10% plan, known as the Wade-Davis bill. It was a stricter substitute for Lincoln's 10% plan, and it laid down conditions of restoration of rebellious states. Also new state governments and formed only by those who had never carried armed against the Union. So the Wade-Davis bill said, if we're going to admit southern states, we're only going to take ones made up of people who weren't Confederate soldiers. And permanent disenfranchisement of Confederate leaders. If you were part of the Confederacy, then you've lost your right to vote in the rebuilt, reconstructed United States. Rather than openly challenging Congress, Lincoln executed a pocket veto of the Wade-Davis bill by just not signing it before Congress adjourned. Subpoint B. Lincoln also initiated informal talks with congressional leaders aimed at trying to find common ground for how Reconstruction could go carry forward. But Lincoln died before he could go carry that out. He was shot and killed by John Wilkes Booth. And so his successor, Vice President Andrew Johnson, held the idea that Reconstruction is entirely an executive plan and shouldn't be carried out by Congress. So Lincoln wanted to make sure that Reconstruction could be carried out, through the legislature. Johnson's like, nope, this is a White House thing. This is not a Congress thing. So Republicans nominated Johnson for vice president in '64 as a way of trying to get political unity. It was, so Johnson was a Democrat, but Republicans nominated him to be on Lincoln's ticket, on Lincoln's running mate in '64, as a way of trying to bring together the Democrats on their side so that Lincoln would go win election. It was a political move. But Andrew Johnson was a Unionist Democrat, and he identified himself as a champion of the honest yeoman. He thought of himself as like the friend of the little guy and a foe of the large planters. He lacked Lincoln's political skills and his sense of public opinion. Johnson was pretty comfortable being unpopular if he thought he was right for being unpopular. After Lincoln's death, he offered, which, by the way, is a fine position to hold in your own life. It's a little tricky when you're a politician. Being popular kind of matters for carrying out your cause. After Lincoln's death, Johnson offered amnesty to all Southerners except for a few Confederate officials and wealthy property owners. If they took allegiance to the Constitution, he basically said, like, even if you were a Confederate, you could come back in and we'll restore all of your property rights. His Reconstruction plan required that only Southern states revoke their ordinances of secession, basically said, just do take-backsies on quitting the Union and repudiate their Confederate debts and go, repay any of that, and then ratify the 13th Amendment. Of course, you can't have slavery there. Within months, all the former Confederate states had met Johnson's requirements for rejoining the Union, and they had functioning elected governments. Because no land redistribution took place, the vast majority of rural freed people remained poor and without property during Reconstruction. Even though Johnson thinks of himself as a champion for doing so, his Reconstruction plan, thinks of himself as a champion of the little guy, his Reconstruction plan doesn't really consider them. A lot of people end up working on, black people end up working on the same white-owned plantations for their former owners, but now as employees. And the model that comes out becomes sharecropping. And sharecropping came to dominate the Cotton South and the Tobacco Belt, initially as a compromise between black people's desire for land and planters' desire for, some labor discipline. For black people, it was preferred to gang labor and slave labor, but over time, sharecropping became pretty oppressive. It's not a good long-term model. It basically says that farmers can go and lease land, and then the way that they go pay the terms of their lease is they share in the profits of the cotton that they're growing on there. It leaves both sides not really making enough money to go make the deal work very well. At first, many Northerners were willing to give Johnson's plan a chance. They basically said, hey, he is the president, maybe we should go give this a go. But over time, the conductive white Southerners turned the Republican North against this plan. The North wasn't motivated by they weren't motivated by a desire to punish, but to make sure that slaves were actually emancipated and actually carried out. And so they might go hear Johnson out for a while on it. Southerners held fast to the antebellum order and enacted slave codes, or black codes, they're no longer slave codes, but black codes, designed to go drive ex-slaves back to plantations, and they'd move to restore slavery and everything but the name of it. Johnson believed that African Americans had no role to play in Reconstruction and didn't really consider their voice or really much of their welfare. Most Southern white planters defined black freedom in the narrowest manner as a privilege, congratulations, we've deigned to give you some freedom, not as a right, believing that the black person, the former slave, was free, but really only free to go do labor. Southerners perceived Johnson's liberal amnesty policy as basically approval of the black codes, saying that, hey, Johnson isn't requiring us to go change any of these conditions of a former slave's life, just the fact that we don't own them anymore, so if he's not requiring it, then he must approve it. It must be a tacit approval of the slave codes. The emboldened ex-Confederates started filling, congressional delegations with old comrades, and including, former Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, gets sent off to go to Congress. I mean, literally, he led a treasonous rebellion against the country, and now he's representing the country in Congress. Republicans at both houses refused to admit these Southern delegations when Congress convened in December of 1865. And by doing so, they blocked Johnson's Reconstruction program. In response, some of the black codes were replaced with non-racial ordinances whose effect was more or less the same. They were able to rewrite the code to not be about being black people, but still have the same effect. And at the same time, across the South, a wave of violence erupted against freedmen. Republicans concluded that the federal government had to go intervene, and this Reconstruction plan wasn't really changing the conditions in the South like it should. Johnson really opposed a number of things that were on his plate. While Congress was voting to extend the life and grow the power of the Freedmen's Bureau, giving it direct funding for the first time and authorizing its agents to go carry on investigations of discrimination against black people, Johnson hated this idea, and he was particularly angry by Congress's Civil Rights Bill, the Civil Rights Act of 1866, that declared that formerly enslaved people should be citizens and grant to them equal protection and rights of contract with full access to the courts. In 1866, Johnson vetoed both bills, both the expansion of the Freedmen's Bureau and the Civil Rights Bill of 1866, declaring that the U.S. government was basically for white men and white men only. Galvanized by Johnson's attacks on the Civil Rights Bill, Republicans overrode his veto. Now, if the president vetoes a bill, Congress can overturn the veto with enough votes. And it doesn't happen very often, but when it happens, it's really clearly Congress sending a message to the president. And they overturned his veto. The Republican resolve was reinforced by news of mounting violence in the South, and they moved to enshrine the black codes in the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. The Republicans wanted to enshrine black rights with the 14th Amendment of the Constitution to overturn those black codes. Johnson opposed the ratification of the 14th Amendment, but Republicans won a 3-1 majority in the 1866 congressional elections, registered overwhelming support for securing the civil rights of former slaves. Subpoint C. Most Republicans were considered to be moderates. They were not the radicals. They were more moderate. But the loudest and most polarizing people in Congress were those radical Republicans, and they set out to entirely remake Southern society. Radical Republicans called to dissolve Johnson's state governments, basically saying like, the state, what you've done is just reassembled your Confederate governments again, and you can't have that. You need to dissolve those and institute new ones that didn't have the rebels in power, didn't have these Confederate, really treasonous rebels in power. You can't restore them to their life. These people that fought against the country. And it gave black people the right to vote. Radicals fully embraced the Civil War era powers, expanded powers of the central government. The leader of the radical Republicans in the House was a guy named Thaddeus Stevens, and his aim was to confiscate the land of disloyal planters and go divide it up among the former slaves. Basically, if you were a planter, not you, it's not about you, but if a person was a planter who had fought on the side of the Confederacy, Thaddeus Stevens wanted to go seize that land and divide it up, and that person no longer gets to own this piece of America. They're going to divide it up and go divide it up among the former slaves and northern migrants in the South who would go protect freedom. His plan was too radical for most of Congress. Thaddeus Stevens was really the firebrand voice of the radical Republicans, but the people on the margins are always limited by their political efficacy. The leader in the Senate was a guy named Charles Sumner, who was nearly caned to death, who we'll remember from earlier this unit, in 1856 by Senator Preston Brooks after delivering his speech, The Crime Against Kansas. He and Stevens battled against Johnson's Reconstruction plans. Following Johnson's vetoes, the Republican Party had a new sense of unity, though, to pull them all together, and they coalesced around the unbending program of the radical Republican minority, led by Sumner in the Senate and Stevens in the House. Both men represented the party's abolitionist strain and the people that were, used to picking big fights. It placed and they're the ones that championed the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. The 14th Amendment of the Constitution enshrined the principle of citizenship for all persons born in the United States and empowered the federal government to go protect the rights of all Americans. It didn't provide for black suffrage, but it basically says black people are citizens. Not all citizens get the right to vote. Most people in this class aren't 18 years old. You're citizens, but you don't get the right to vote. So citizenship doesn't immediately give the ability for suffrage and voting. But the 14th Amendment wanted to make sure that the citizenship rights would be extended to anybody born in the country, which would cover all of the slaves at that point. And it produced an intense division among the parties. Democrats unanimously opposed the 14th Amendment, and most Republicans, not unanimously, but most Republicans were for the 14th Amendment. Johnson campaigned against it. Johnson, our Democrat, now president, campaigned against the 14th Amendment in the 1866 midterm elections. All the southern states, except for Tennessee, refused to ratify the amendment. In March of 1867, over Johnson's veto, Congress adopted the Reconstruction Act, which began the radical era of Reconstruction, and it lasted until 1877. So now we're seeing like a third approach to Reconstruction. There was the 10% plan, that failed. There was Johnson's Reconstruction plan, that seemed to be failing. And then the Congress goes and takes over Reconstruction. And its loudest voices are the radical Republicans in Congress. And they run Reconstruction through 1877. It divided the South into 5 military districts, which would be carried out by the military, not by elected officials. And it called for a recreation of new state governments with black people given the right to vote, basically saying that, while on the federal level they may not have the right to vote, in these southern states specifically, you are going to give black people the right to vote. And that's the voice of the radical Republicans that are pushing forward this new phase of Reconstruction. Roman numeral number 14. In 1867, Congress passed a law that I think we can really say was just there to go bait Johnson, known as the Tenure of Office Act. The Tenure of Office Act was there to restrict the power of the president, to remove certain office holders without the approval of the Senate. So let's kind of put ourselves in the political context of the day. Lincoln appoints all of his cabinet members, and to get appointed to the cabinet, you have to go be approved by the Senate to go do so. Lincoln's a Republican, and when Lincoln dies, Johnson takes office, and they're two very different people. Even though they're on the same ticket, they're two very different people with two very different views of how the country should be run and how Reconstruction should be run. And Johnson doesn't like a lot of members of Lincoln's old cabinet, and so wants to remove them and put in his own people for his own cabinet, for his own advice and administration to do so. Congress says, that Congress is full of Republicans at this point and saying, we don't want Johnson's cabinet to go take office. We disagree with Johnson's goals, political goals and policy goals. So they pass a law saying, these are the people we've approved, and no, you can't just go firing them because you don't like them. If they've been approved by the Senate, then they should be, they hold their office. It's called the Tenure of Office Act. And it was specifically designed to restrict the power of the presidency, and I think to bait Johnson into go testing the law. Johnson didn't sign that law, the Tenure of Office Act, but it was signed over his veto. Congress went and passed it without his veto. And it purported to deny the power of the president to go fire any person unless the Senate approved the removal during the next full session of Congress. So basically, Johnson could go announce that he wanted to go fire a person, but then the next time that Congress puts together, then the Senate can go vote on whether or not the person should actually be fired. To demonstrate his dislike for the Tenure of Office Act, I think Johnson walked right into the trap, and he suspended the Secretary of War, a guy named Edwin Stanton, and replaced him with Ulysses S. Grant in violation of the act. And I think this is actually a pretty clever move on Johnson's act. He says that Grant was a Lincoln guy, and that's the guy that should be the Secretary of War. Now that the war is over, we should make him, what's now the Defense Secretary. We should put Grant in the cabinet. And I think he's basically saying, the Tenure of Office Act is a bad idea, and I'm going to show it's a bad idea by, yes, taking the bait, but to try to bait you into firing a guy that was a Lincoln guy that I'm trying to put into office. The law was specifically set up to go do that. The Senate went ahead and called Johnson's bluff. They overruled Stanton's suspension. Grant resigned. He basically says, look, okay, well, if I can't take this, then I'm going to go resign from office, and said Stanton should go resume office as Secretary of War. The House Republicans then saying, we have a president who's in violation of the law, and they introduced 11 articles of impeachment for high crimes and misdemeanors, but mostly for violation of the Tenure of Office Act. Johnson became the first American president to be impeached on March 3rd, 1868, when the House formally adopted articles of impeachment and forwarded them to the United States Senate for adjudication. So impeachment doesn't mean removal of office. There's two phases of impeachment. The first one is, if you're familiar with criminal trials, it's closer to an indictment. To impeach means to point out the flaws in something, and the House impeached Johnson, saying, you are unfit for president under these conditions. And then goes and gets handed off to the United States Senate, who will actually hold a trial, and if the president is found guilty, then they would be removed from office to do so. When the founders were setting up, the founders said that every now and then you're going to appoint a president who's a scoundrel, and you'll need to have a way to get rid of them, but it should be slow and difficult and involve the other two branches. So you have two houses of Congress, and also the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court presides over the trial. So it's designed to be a slow and methodical process. It's happened 3 times, and in no case has the president been removed actually from office. The presidents have been impeached, but not actually removed from office. But Johnson's the first one to go to do that. When it goes to trial in the Senate, began 3 days later. The Senate didn't convict Johnson on the articles with a 35 to 19 vote in favor of conviction. It fell just short of the necessary 2/3 majority by a single vote. 10 days later, the Senate tried again on different article of impeachment. That conviction also failed. The Senate failed with 1 vote short. The real result was that they had just bullied Johnson into to kind of fear for his job, and they basically said they had marginalized the man enough that Johnson was felt pretty powerless to go continue his plan of Reconstruction. The impeachment trial of Andrew Johnson had important political implications for the balance of power between the federal legislature and the federal executive. It maintained the principle that Congress should not remove the president from office simply because they don't like his politics or his style or his administration. I mean, in this case, nobody liked those things about Johnson, but it wasn't enough to actually remove him from office. It also brought diminished presidential influence over public policy and overall governing power, and for a long time it really moved the balance of power into Congress as the real director of policy. And that brings us to the election of 1868 and the 15th Amendment. Ulysses S. Grant was the Republicans' nominee for president in 1868, and he won out over the Democrats' nominee, a guy named Horatio Seymour. Republicans retained 2/3 majorities in both houses of Congress. The 15th Amendment being proposed to the Constitution, it forbade either the federal government or the states of the ability to deny citizens the right to vote on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The 15th Amendment was going to extend the right to vote to black people. And it became inevitably central to the former slaves' desire for empowerment and equality. Being denied suffrage was carrying the mark of inferiority, the stigma of being less of a person. The amendment so it provided for black suffrage, allowed black people the right to vote. But it had a lot of loopholes to it. The 15th Amendment was not a perfect amendment. States could discriminate on a basis other than race, like illiteracy or the inability to go pay a tax, among others. It also didn't extend suffrage to women. Women don't get the right to vote out of the 15th Amendment either. Both were concessions to northern and western states who thought extending too much voting would, it's like immigrants or to unworthy peoples. That's just a bad idea. Still, to demonstrate their patriotism, black people throughout the South organized 4th of July celebrations. And in a lot of ways, the first time the black people were celebrating the 4th of July. A lot of time, and it kind of shifted the power. For years, black people didn't participate in the 4th of July, and you have Frederick Douglass's great speech on why would you participate in the 4th of July? You're denying, it's a holiday of freedom, yet you have slaves. And then it switches in the South, where black people say, yay, we can participate in the celebrations of freedom. But white people start saying that, yes, but you shouldn't have that freedom. And white people in the South start refusing to participate in 4th of July celebrations as well. It's a weird turn of events. States still under federal control were required to ratify that amendment before being readmitted to the Union. So states in the 5 military districts who hadn't come back into the Union yet were required to go ratify the 15th Amendment on the way in, and it became part of the Constitution in 1870. Passage of the 15th Amendment was an astonishing feat. Lawmakers elsewhere in the Western Hemisphere had left emancipated slaves in a condition of semi-citizenship with no real voting rights. But after the 15th Amendment is ratified, hundreds of thousands of African American men flocked to polls across the South. And this atmosphere of collective pride and celebration, and finally the full participation in the practice of America was enfranchised to them. The laws and the amendments of Reconstruction reflected the intersection really of 2 products of the Civil War era: a newly empowered national state and the idea of a national citizenry enjoying equality before the law. Before the Civil War, American citizenship was closely linked to race. The Naturalization Act of 1790, for instance, limited the naturalization process to white people. Only white people could even have the process to become citizens. The Dred Scott decision of 1857 denied black people even the possibility of U.S. citizenship. But these new amendments to the Constitution had transformed the relationship between the federal government and the state power. And I think this is among the real lasting legacies of the Civil War era, that it transforms what America is. we see a rhetorical shift in American life as well. The Civil War becomes a movement from these United States, which we often hear in the rhetoric of history, that seems to emphasize like all of the parts to it, to the United States, as in the whole, this cohesive approach to the whole, both in terms of the way that the states are going to be put together, but also the way that Americans approach each other, of social classes, of sectional divides, of racial divides. It's not a perfect story, but it's a fascinating story, and I can't wait to tell you more about it. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.